sounds so sleazy.
They have the
That's great. My work is probably like 2 weeks. So yeah.
They have many tools.
There
There are books.
It has all the things that you can imagine. Close your eyes, picture all the things. That's what they have. I don't like the interaction. I missed it. We should have very soon interaction with Vanessa and Alana. Alana was being like weird. Alana wanted to get coffee. She like told me that. She was mad that I invited like 6 people, but I purposely invited you. She just wanted to know what I knew, and I was like, I'm just tell you everything that I know. But I kind of did. I would go on this border. Yeah, I would totally go to this border. That's what I'm going to do when you're in Kampala. Yeah. Seriously. Why don't you just split the time between get top recording? Well, you'll get something. You'll get like a traveler visa, whatever we end up doing. They're going to come from DC. It takes 25 hours. I might not go to Nairobi until November because I have like this dentistry thing happen, and it's like I can either do it and then come back for Christmas. Well, I figured I'd no, but I think that if I just leave for Nairobi later, then I'll just stay. I would want to come for Christmas because
You have to come back for Christmas. How long do you want to stay for?
I mean, it depends where we're going. His family's going to Christmas, but I'll be there.
No, my family. I think I wouldn't come.
Okay.
But I'm
When's Patty coming? She's going to be in Ethiopia for work.
I'm constrained by my tickets.
Oh God, you booked some dumb ticket. Yeah, I told him already to change it. You changed it, right? Day after New Year's. You changed it.
To like the second. I don't have a choice. It's not my choice.
But you get to change it. You told me that you hadn't chosen that one. You sent it to me and said, should I change it? I said, yeah, change it to the 4th.
And then I did, and I sent it to them, and they pushed back because I'm not supposed to stay for longer than 3 months.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm getting like more, trying to get more wiggle room, but I'm just saying, like, I can't stay for like.
You can take a week of vacation, right?
Yeah, but I'm gonna have a ticket.
Okay, well, we'll figure that out.
I'm gonna have a ticket.
Okay.
So I have to like be in Nairobi on the second.
Or you can change the ticket. Did you have your really good year back?
It's all part of the same package. I mean, they haven't booked it. They haven't booked it yet.
I'm just wondering why you can't ask them right now for a week of vacation between the 2nd and the 3rd.
I can, but I have to go to Ethiopia and then take my vacation back.
But you want to fly crazy. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's cheaper to fly to Chicago. I feel like that's like the easy answer. Wait, so it's because it's actually the hard one. You know better.
I mean, they're really strict about it.
But it was October 2nd. No, it says September 29th.
December 29th is like technically what I'm supposed to do. Right?
You have vacation time, then you should just call the State Department and
The vacation is not the same thing as like the flights.
No, but if you're taking vacation in the country where you're living, then you shouldn't have to leave the country really and go back.
I just don't think it's. And I have to, and also I have to make that decision like next week.
But is your family actually coming? Because that is what everything is. You can't go anywhere during this.
I'll find out on Sunday.
Okay, great. Because ideally, if I came right before Christmas for New Year's, then no one in my office would really notice I was gone. It doesn't matter if I was like
Right. They'll work that if you're first, right?
yeah.
I mean that's.
But I get so I get like 2 days next week.
Why?
We're on that week. But it's like,
Oh my god, I'm like fighting that I don't have to.
it was the worst, like, looking when we did it. Like, it's so great. Nothing's gonna happen. Don't worry about it, guys. Oh yeah, everything's better than ever. Oh, anyways, it was like no one cares about anything.
They just like rush it off.
We would have noticed, you know, that vacation days were very
They probably won't. And like the week between Christmas and New Year's is the perfect time to do something.
right.
It's just that I think I'm gonna be having to leave right after New Year's. That week after New Year's is gonna be sticky.
Also, then we'll probably have to move out of whatever apartment we're living in on the first or second. But it's fine. Also, I could stay and close out the apartment and do all that if you really actually have to go. You got it.
That's true. You don't have your
Yeah. Definitely don't have any plans. I'm just gonna be fine in 1 week. So I'm ready to go.
yeah.
Even if Tim comes home next summer.
Well, I am.
Even when Tim comes home next summer, I don't know.
Alright, well, let's figure out who the actual
Yeah, I mean, Patty's gonna be in the like 100%. So she's gonna just come. She's already decided on that.
But Heather was like, Heather has talked about it multiple times.
I mean, we tried saving it to the future, but
It's just really expensive.
And let's figure out where we want to go.
Patty's already been to Mozambique. You'd go again.
We totally don't have to do that for some reason.
No, if it's a nice.
Incredibly exciting.
I think it would be fun to go to like a beach for a couple days.
I was in the capital.
It's insanely expensive to get anywhere. It's like $1,000 to go to Nigeria. That's why I think like Tanzania, Kenya,
my initial thoughts were based on what you can actually not until I did
Not to put them on the bus, but we are.
Yeah,
When Nina just looked at me and said, "Who am I going to be friends?"
This is only going to be like a week anyway.
yeah.
Yeah, but like,
I
you
mean,
know,
like 10 days. She's like a little
yeah, takes me to
25
get there,
hours to
yeah.
get there for us. So, and obviously, if you guys don't have time, we're not.
You don't have time.
You don't have time. I know. Yeah.
I do actually.
Yeah. Let's do it. All right.
Sorry.
Oh my God, that mini mouse. Okay.
Oh, here, we got this one.
Okay.
Are we ready? Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. Before I introduce Alexis and the Pulitzer Center, I just want to let everyone know that this event is being live streamed to our YouTube channel. So just to give everyone a little disclaimer. Welcome to the Pulitzer Center. My name is Okeowo. I'm a project coordinator here. For the new faces in the audience, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism organization that supports international reporting and global journalism education. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Alexis Okeowo, staff writer at The New Yorker and former Pulitzer Center grantee. Alexis is also a fellow at the New America Foundation. Her previous Pulitzer Center reporting projects were China's Bloody Frontier in Zambia and The Promise of Life, Reproductive Choice in Africa. Tonight, she is going to talk about her work for the New America Foundation and the New Yorker on the anti-extremism movement across Africa. Alexis is here in DC this week for the 2016 Joint Convention for the National Associations of Black and Hispanic Journalists. Today, she represented us on a panel on breaking into foreign freelancing, so we're glad that she could make it tonight to speak again. So I'll let her take it from there, and we'll have questions after her presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. As she mentioned, I'm working on a book about anti-extremism across Africa, namely people who are standing up and resisting extremism in 4 countries on the continent. I was drawn to this idea because I realized through years of reporting on the continent that there were a lot of people, brave and flawed people, who were in their own ways resisting extremist forces in Africa, whether it's extreme Islam, extreme Christianity, something like slavery, or whatever extremist force it was, whether it's in the spheres of gender or sexuality or religion. There were people who were in their own ways standing up to it, and I feel like those people weren't getting enough notice. And I also feel like their stories were the most interesting to me in order to talk about these issues. And so I've been spending the last 2 years writing about people in 4 countries. The first one is actually my most recent trip, which was to Somalia. And I was interested in Somalia because this is a country that has basically been in a state of near anarchy for quite some time, since the Civil War broke out in 1991. For a while, it was ruled by the Islamic Courts Union, and since then, the rise of al-Shabaab has really affected the way people live their lives. It's really placed a limit on the way, especially women, are able to be free, and in the way they're able to go about what they want to do. And so I thought what was really interesting there are some women athletes, namely the Somali women's basketball team. A lot of the women on these team are in their late teens or in their early 20s. And ever since the Islamic Courts Union was in power, they had this decree: if you're a woman, you can't play sports, and if you are, then your arm or your foot should be cut off. And this sounds kind of abstract, but when women are walking around and going about their business, a lot of the women on this team have been threatened. Some of my protagonists in that story, one girl, she's like 18 years old, and she's had a gun pulled on her like 5 times by Al-Shabaab militants who have followed her from the basketball court, and she still keeps playing. And that simple act of still continue to play basketball in this country where she's not only threatened for it, but she could be killed for it, and she does know someone who has been killed for it, to me was very remarkable. And so I wanted to go tell her story and the story of some of her teammates who are playing the sport in a country where the Somali women's basketball team used to be one of the most noted in East Africa. Women played with their hair uncovered, they played in shorts, they played, they were mostly uncovered like you are when you're playing basketball. Now, even though the girls still wear headscarves, they still wear long pants, they still get a lot of crap from, they get threatening calls, they get, as I said, guns pulled on them for just wanting to be a teenage girl playing a sport. And so I thought that was remarkable and an interesting way to talk about what's happening in that country and how the Somali people are incredibly resilient. After so many terror attacks, so much threats against them, in Mogadishu, anywhere you go, any restaurant, any nightclub has been bombed before, it's been raided before by militants. And yet the next week, people will show up and they'll be back there, they'll be drinking, they'll be dancing, they'll be eating at this place that was just raided by Al-Shabaab a few months before, where 40 people were killed. I went to several places in Mogadishu where that had happened. And so I thought that was remarkable about Somalia. That's what was interesting, is the resiliency of a people who are living in this fundamentally broken state. And while I was there, on the way there, I had stopped in Nairobi. And this isn't in the book, but Kenya has had a big problem with a lot of its, not a lot, but some of its youth, whether they're Somali Kenyan or Kenyan Muslim, being recruited by Al-Shabaab, and even now some analysts tell me to ISIS. And so there's this remarkable teacher there who teaches at a high school in a neighborhood called Eastleigh, which is predominantly Somali. And in his business classes, he incorporates lessons about resisting extremism. He'll have a lesson where he'll just be let's talk about what radicalization is. Let's talk about what Islam is and isn't. And let's talk about what happens if one of your friends comes up to you at a football game and is like, hey, what do you, aren't you angry at the state? Shouldn't we do something about it? And they have this interactive lesson for the whole class talking about how to resist extremism and how to resist a terror group coming to recruit them. And I thought that was really interesting. So I wrote about that. It's on the book. But I'm drawn to these characters of these people who are trying to do something in their own way to resist against what's happening to their communities. And in Nigeria, where I've spent a lot of time over the past couple years, I'm also interested in how people are fighting, standing up to the force of extreme Islam, especially with regards to Boko Haram. For a while, Boko Haram, it's been reported, and understandably, as this group that's ravaging the Northeast. It's been killing thousands of people, abducting hundreds of people, forcing millions of people to leave their homes, but at the same time, not everyone is a victim, and not everyone wants to be just a victim. And so in 2014, I spent some time with a guy who was a commander in a vigilante force in Northeast Nigeria. And it was now it might be more. At the time, it was 8,000 people, 8,000 men and a few women who had literally just taken up arms. And they were sort of old-fashioned guns in a way. They look like muskets. But they were effective and they were fighting Boko Haram. Like they had a network through the major city in the Northeast and through villages, like copycat groups were popping up through the region. And they were just literally fighting it because the army had turned out to be completely useless. You know, they were either running away from battles or they were just not showing up when the residents called them to do something about the fact that they heard an attack was coming to their town. And so, you know, they're setting up checkpoints to rid members of Boko Haram that they knew were in their towns. Because, I mean, for a while in the northeast of Nigeria, members of Boko Haram were just living among the communities. You know, you would know that your neighbor was Boko Haram, but you were too afraid to report it to the armed forces because you didn't want the armed forces to retaliate against you because they were so heavy-handed, and you didn't want Boko Haram to retaliate against you. So what they did at first was just go around and round up everyone that they knew was Boko Haram. And it really resulted in that major city in the northeast being rid of the group for a while. And then after that, they would you know, sort of set up units, and they would engage in firefights with these guys whenever they heard there was an attack going on in a village. I mean, these guys were really brave. In fact, there was an assault on the biggest city in the Northeast at the beginning of last year, and the military was sort of like nowhere to be found, and these vigilantes were really the ones responsible for holding a few cities in the Northeast. And so, obviously, you know, this guy is incredibly interesting. He's a devout Muslim, and he used to be like a state auditor, so this was not something he had been used to doing. So it was interesting to follow him and spend time with him and see how someone who like went to school for accounting all of a sudden picked up a gun and decided he wanted to like fight terrorists. You know, for a variety of reasons, for love of country, for love of his family, for love of his community. And so I thought that was an interesting way to talk about what was happening in Nigeria. At the same time, I'm also talking about one of the girls who was kidnapped by Boko Haram into the town of Chibok about 2 years ago. She was one of the girls who escaped in the early weeks. She literally just like jumped off a truck and ran back home. And she was traumatized for a long time, but then she ended up going back to school, I would say like the following year. But just the act of her going back to school was, I mean, it was pretty huge. I mean, she had been kidnapped literally for the fact of being in school first. She was taking her final exams, you know, ready to finish, and then she was taken just for the fact, you know, that she wanted to study and be a lawyer. And so when she finally decided that she could go back to school, now in the capital in Abuja, it was pretty powerful, and it was difficult for her at first, but now she's back there and she's, you know, trying to do what she wanted to do. And so her story from like, you know, from growing up in this town of Chibok that suddenly became an epicenter of the crisis and now being back is something I'm also writing about. And then after that I go to Uganda in the east of Africa, where I talk about the extremist Christian rebel group, the Lord's Resistance Army, which, you know, despite having been active for decades, is still somehow, you know, still active, is still kind of wreaking havoc in Central Africa. And this is more of an unusual story because I'm talking about how the LRA, they abducted like thousands of children at its height. I would say like in the 90s when it abducted tens of thousands of children. And a lot of those children, obviously when they were abducted in a captivity, they were forced to do horrible things. They were forced to kill people and things like that. And what they would do with a lot of the abducted kids is they would pair them together. So they would abduct the boys, and then they would abduct girls to basically be their sex slaves. And then they would say that they had married them. And a lot of these couples, though, had children in captivity, formed bonds, and then a lot of the men ended up letting their bush wives escape along with the children. And so after a lot of these wives have gotten back to their former communities with their children, and then the men have escaped, the women have agreed with, to some would say an alarming frequency, to marry these men and to be with them again while they're free, because they say that the bond between these two people is something that they can't find anywhere else. Often when they get back, they're stigmatized and it's hard to find another partner. And they believe that just by being together, at least the couple that I'm focusing on, that it's in a way an act of resistance against what the LRA tried to do, which was just to break their bonds of family, which is to break their bonds of normalcy, and what they could have had they not been abducted. And so it's controversial what this couple has done, but in a way I kind of admire their strength and their commitment to each other, despite the fact that they were put together in such brutal conditions. And you know, there are communities all over northern Uganda that are trying to heal after what the LRA has done. You know, you have former child soldiers who have come back and are living next to families where they may have killed some of their relatives or harmed them. And so these communities are trying to like find a way back after this group has completely ruptured so much of what was once there. And then after that, I go to Mauritania, which is a very unusual place. Mauritania is at the crossroads of Western and Northern Africa, and it's one of the last places with pretty much widespread slavery. It has the highest incidence of slavery in the world, and it's also a Muslim country. And I wrote a story about an activist there who is incredibly fascinating. He's a devout Muslim, and he's a descendant of slaves, and he is using just sort of like radical measures to kind of force the government to acknowledge and to abolish slavery. And he's led the most successful anti-slavery movement to date there. He's been jailed a ton of times. And his whole argument is that, you know, a lot of local imams there use they use certain legal books in Islam to justify slavery. And so he's all about using religion, using Islam to prove that slavery shouldn't exist, and he frees slaves. And he got in trouble because a couple years ago he burned these holy Islamic legal books in a public prayer, and he got thrown in jail. But I mean, it's you know, the government has been forced to acknowledge slavery. They've had to jail slave owners for the first time. So he's had a lot of success, but at a lot of personal risk, because he just got out of jail again after a year and a half there. And so he's the one activist in my book, and I find him really fascinating because I'm curious as to what drives a person to put themselves at so much risk for a cause that not only is so great and so broad, but also that in a way is not necessarily guaranteed. I mean, the government is still steadfast and not, not trying to enact too much reform. So it's kind of curious, you know, it's interesting to me why he keeps willing to go back to jail, suffer so much for this cause. And so basically what I'm trying to do is just talk about some of these forces in Africa, but talk about the people who are trying to do something about it, so that it's not such a, you know, I'm not trying to write such a dark, depressing project. I'm trying to talk about people who are, you know, who had upbringings that are not so different, you know, who had mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and who liked soccer and liked to play music and, you know, liked to do all of these things, but because of circumstance have had to take a stand on something. And as a result, have had to do something about that. You know, once they took that stand, they couldn't just stop. They had to keep taking steps after step in order to accomplish what they wanted to do. And they just happened to be very dramatic situations that I'm talking about. But extremism is very dramatic. And I think that's it.
Thank you. So now we'll open it up to questions and kind of have, you know, an interactive Q&A with Alexis. People who have questions, yeah, please.
I don't
we'll
really
understand. Sorry,
understand.
1 second. We're going to pass the mic to you just because we're live streaming. Thank you.
I came without really knowing what I was coming into. So you keep talking about your work and your book, but can you talk a little bit more about where we can find all of this information?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a staff writer at The New Yorker, so my work is there. But before that, I was freelancing for a long time, so my work for a variety of places, for The New York Times, for Bloomberg, Financial Times. So I've written a lot of articles, some of which were kind of roots for my current book project. But then my book will be out next September.
And then do you have a visual component at all? Or is it all just writing?
I'm not a photographer, but the book might probably have a few photos. Yeah.
I was just wondering if these sort of individual stories that you're following here, do they kind of add up to a trend? I mean, are you finding that the sort of grassroots resistance to extremism is this actually something that's being effective on a sort of broader scale beyond these sort of individual stories in a way that maybe government action isn't or can't be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that in some cases, like I think, for example, in Mauritania with the activist who has sort of mobilized a movement, I think that is powerful, and I think that's something that the government should harness there. And I think it's been tricky for them because the activist group, he hasn't been able to register with the government, and I think it's been difficult with that. But I think and then also in Nigeria too, I mean, it's tricky supporting armed groups, I think, that aren't affiliated with the military or the government, but I think there may be some kind of lesson or something to be derived from there. When the military of a country is not working, then what do we do? How do we deal with insurgent violence? And then I think in the other situations, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult because it's so individual, you know, with the basketball player who's continuing to play because even though she's been threatened, or the couples in Uganda, I think the impact is more on their communities rather than perhaps a replicable countrywide effect.
Hi, I'm Diane Albrecht. I work at the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. We do a lot of projects just on combating violent extremism in Africa, and I was wondering, kind of as a follow-up to what the gentleman was saying, what role you think foreign assistance has to play in this work. I think one of our struggles is trying to see what's happening at the grassroots and then linking into that and supporting that rather than just, you know, coming in and imposing something random.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the best way, because I think sometimes, especially with U.S. government assistance, I mean, if you look at the war against Boko Haram in Nigeria, I mean, sometimes it's been counteractive, and I think they've begun to realize that because they've been aiding a military that has engaged in a lot of human rights abuses and things like that. Whereas if it is from the ground up, I think that's helpful. I think the trick is often identifying what will work on the grassroots, because there are obviously so many initiatives. But yeah, I think that's the way to go.
So what's the difference between extremism and terrorism, and is that something that's interchangeable, or did you see separate issues with them?
Yeah, that's a question. I mean, I think it's part of the same thing. I think that terrorism is when it's, you know, when it leads to violence. I mean, I think there can be extremist ideologies that perhaps don't lead to violence, but I think unfortunately it often does. And I think in all of these cases,
So like a cult, for example, could be extremism without terrorism because it's taking one idea to an extreme without the violence.
yeah, although, I mean, you could argue that with a cult, you know, it's the people who are sort of been brainwashed in the cult, there's, in a way, violence is being done against them. Yeah, and most of the places I focus on, it seemed like it had escalated into terrorism. Even in Mauritania, I mean, slavery is a form of terrorism, the way it's enacted against the people, and the way, and it came from an extremist ideology.
Hi. Did you discern a common denominator among all these people who are fairly ordinary but did something extraordinary in this sort of grassroots resistance? They're from vastly different cultures and even different geographical areas on the continent, but did you see a common thread running among them?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think I saw that, because in the book I talk about their childhoods too, and I felt like they all either had parents or somehow influences that encouraged them to be stronger than when they were young. They had gone through experiences that forced them to like sort of grow up a little bit when they were younger, whether it was death of relatives or something where they had to be on their own. But it seemed like a lot of them had some sort of early on when nothing else was really going on that forced them to kind of grow up a little bit faster. And then that kind of strength kind of translated through their experiences and led them to start resisting in different ways.
Hi. I was wondering, with your book, what kind of audience do you think that you had in mind while writing it? Also, was there like a core misunderstanding of the region that you were hoping to address with the book, or was it just to put a human face to the conflict? I'm just curious about what was the thought process behind writing.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it was putting a human face, and I think that really came into focus when I was writing about Boko Haram. Because especially for a while there, you would just hear news about attack every week saying 200 people were killed, and the next week 100 people, and it's just like, it just becomes numbers, and you don't have any sense of who are the people behind it, who they were, and I thought that would be such an interesting thing to talk about, who was going through this. But then also, I did want to, I was very conscious about, I wanted to portray some kind of strength and like, what's the word, people who just things weren't being done to, but that they were doing things themselves, who weren't just victims, rather. I was very interested in that. Because I feel like sometimes when people talk about conflicts on the continent, it's just about, all the bad things that have happened to a person that they've endured, whereas what about the people who are trying to do something about it in their own ways? And as far as the audience, I mean, I think at the general audience, I'm trying to tell the stories because I'm thinking about general audience because, and that's why I'm telling the stories in these ways. I didn't want to do like an academic book where I'm talking about extremism, in a general way, or Africa in a general way. I wanted to tell it where it's just through people's stories.
Hi, what's the relationship between activism against extremism and activism against corrupt regimes or military rule or strongmen? Is there a relationship between them, and are there different activists? Is it the same people? And
Yeah, I mean, I think they overlap for sure. I mean, I think that in pretty much all the countries I've named, there have problems of extremely corrupt governments. And I think that, you can't really do one without the other. Like the activist in Mauritania, he can't, agitate against slavery without talking about how corrupt the President Aziz is, and I think he does both. Because you have to, I think a lot of them think about what do we want, what is the ultimate goal, and if it is government change, then they have to address it in both ways. I don't really talk in the book at too much length about the corruption of these states. I kind of take it as granted for a little bit, but it's definitely a key thing, and I think it comes out when I'm talking about why these insurgencies, why these crises have gotten so much worse, and it is because of corruption. It is because of ineffective leadership. There's no reason the Boko Haram crisis or, the crisis in Somalia should have gotten so bad were it not for corrupt, ineffective leadership.
It was really a very good talk. It speaks well for you that you chose to focus on the self-help and the courage of people who had faced challenges early in their lives and came out with strong enough to do something about it when it counted. But it's really it appeals a lot to Americans, I can tell you that. But I'm in the State Department, and I was wondering if you had run across at all. I thought you were going to talk about Kenya and Somalia more than Mauritania and Nigeria, but the Leahy program. The Leahy Act program, a Leahy program that we support, where military assistance security assistance is being provided, they vet all the people in a unit. and find out, they track down, see who has had human rights violations, and they try to retrain units, whole units of soldiers and individuals.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought about Nigeria. It sounds like they're more hanging back rather than overtly committing all kinds of violations themselves. They're just not. What you were mentioning is that they're not active enough. But did you run across the Leahy program at all, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, but in Nigeria there was that problem because they are actively committing abuses, and so I think the U.S. had to reevaluate how. I think it pulled back a lot of its aid, and, like it wouldn't share intelligence and it wouldn't do certain things because it didn't want to enable the military to continue doing abuses. And I know that in Somalia it's tricky too.
Well, they're very active in Somalia and Kenya, but I
Right.
hadn't even thought about
Yeah.
Nigeria and
Yeah, but it's interesting that I think there's like a tightrope between wanting to help these armies and help these states fight against terrorism, but then also trying to keep them accountable, because I mean, and in Somalia too, there's been a problem of the military committing abuses as they go after terrorist suspects, and in Kenya as well.
In the Western Hemisphere, the School of the Americas
Right.
has gotten all kinds of trouble
Right.
from training officers for all South American militaries, trying to train them in human rights,
Right.
but also training them how to do really good counterinsurgency.
Exactly.
Really good.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was most impressed by the story of the young woman who had been held captive for so long, went back to her village and was taken in, and that her husband or who had taken, that it was hard for them,
Yeah.
community, to accept this. And I wonder about the ability and the struggle to forgive. Whether this is a question of maturity, is there hope, reason to hope that things like this, that people can change and be readmitted into these societies in some form or another, that this was just a phase in the life of Africa and the world, so to say.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the story I feel closest to, because and actually on my last trip there, it was encouraging because it seemed like they were being more accepted by the community. Their neighbors were beginning to help them, and there was a realization that this is something that had happened to all of us, and that it had happened worse to them, but it wasn't essentially their fault. And so I think Northern Uganda is a really interesting study in how communities kind of get past extremely traumatic experiences and like the phases they go through, that extreme anger and then eventually reconciliation and forgiveness. And I think places like Rwanda are still going through that. I don't talk about Rwanda, but it's common in a few places.
Hi, I'm kind of curious about, through these 4 countries, like the people that you profiled and you encountered during your reporting, how they feel about extremism and terrorism as an existential issue. It's an easy comparison to make here in this country as well as in, most of the developed world about terrorism emerging as a very urgent, almost an existential issue for these folks. So I was wondering if you could possibly give us any lessons or any insights that folks might have had, and also just from a personal perspective, maybe if you could try to talk to us about how you felt freelancing, in hostile areas, given the fact that the last number of years, although there's always been an issue, there have been, a lot of serious issues with freelancers, trying to report in hostile and conflict areas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting first question, because I think most of the people I focus on didn't necessarily have an existential a sense of extremism as this worldwide thing. Their focus was very much on their world and their communities, except for the activist in Mauritania who, interestingly enough, very much tied his movement to the movement against apartheid in South Africa and the movement, actually the civil rights movement. And so it's interesting that he had that notion of what works, and that's what he's really modeled his movement on. He believes this is what works, civil resistance. This is how you pressure governments to stop abusive practices. And I think that, I mean, you know, when I was a freelancer working in some of these places, I mean, even now as a staff writer, when I do research in places like Somalia, I mean, I think, you know, you have a greater sense of what the risks are and what you need to do to protect yourself against it that maybe I didn't have, you know, like 5-6 years ago. You know, when I was in Somalia earlier this year, you know, I'd been talking with a local guide for like months and months, trying to plan everything down to the T of where I would stay, how I'd move around. And of course, things always change, but I think, you know, it's so important to have the contacts that you can trust, because that will, I think, help you a lot when you're on the ground. And, you know, luckily both trips went well, but I think it's a huge concern. I think people are being more careful than ever. And, I mean, I certainly am. And, yeah. But at the same time, I don't think it should stop you from covering these stories, because I think, you know, Africa is already undercovered, and so, you know, then there becomes the risk of these stories not being told at all.
You talk about 4 different countries in which the extremism expresses itself in different ways and has different origins and something. Do you think Americans in reporting assume that it's all the same too often? Is there too little differentiation in what the context is?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's like that Africa's a country thing, and I think, you know, too often, yeah, there is a conflation of this incredibly diverse continent into one place, and so I hope that, you know, through the stories of these very different places, I mean, there are connections, there are parallels among some of the stories, but all these 4 places are incredibly different and going through incredibly different things. Some are further along than others. Some are doing a lot better than others, but I hope it conveys some of the diversity of the continent.
So, regarding that diversity, because there's still such a massive array beyond those 4 countries of African states and different politics, and curious about so somewhere like Central African Republic, if attitudes amongst people fighting in what's just a full-out civil war are similar, I guess, to people who are countering extremism, where so if you're from one ethnic group and you're opposed to someone from the Silicon, the anti-Balka, if you're opposing someone from that, do you kind of is there a similar mental mindset, if you get what I'm saying, to someone who is just from at least an American standpoint, like if you're countering extremism, that's necessarily a good thing, whereas if you're opposing another ethnic group in a religious and ethnic conflict, it's not necessarily a good thing. It's devolved into civil war. But is the mindset similar for the locals fighting?
I don't know. I would tend to say no, because I mean, I don't know what the mindset is of someone, you know, who's engaged in civil war, but I think in those situations, what I tend to see when I look at them is like people being manipulated by their political leaders, right? Who use ethnicity or who use religion in order to pit people against each other. And so why I was drawn to these other people is that, I mean, a lot of them, except for one, aren't really that religious. They don't really talk about their ethnic groups. They're kind of just trying to live their lives as people. And so with that mindset, they weren't, I think it's different because, you know, they're not, their only aim is not to go after other people or to go after another group or whatever. It's just to kind of live the lives that they want to live, and to protect their families and to protect their communities, but without hurting other people, I suppose, unless it's opposing the government in some way.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the LRA, and we hear many different stories about what's happening right now. I've heard numbers as low as 100, and then much, much higher numbers. So I wonder if you have any information or what your personal opinion is about that. And then you also talked about people in Uganda, dealing with the aftermath of the LRA, and that's been pretty successful. And I know that Central African Republic is one of the countries you're covering, but how is that country dealing with the aftermath of the LRA?
Which country?
Central Africa.
Oh, I'm actually not. I'm not covering. I'm just Uganda. I'm not doing Central African Republic.
Right. I just wondered if you knew anything.
If I knew, yeah. Well, I mean, I think what they say now is that LRA has about 200 core fighters. Sometimes maybe it drops down to maybe as little as 100, but they're continually being able to abduct people, through Central African Republic, through South Sudan, and I think that's where the danger still comes for them, is that they're still being able to pillage villages, kill people, and then abduct them and add them to this kind of core group. And it's just been so hard for the Ugandan military, even aided with the U.S. military so many times with so much money, to actually get these guys, because they are so adept at working in the bush. And so even though, you would say, 200 people, that's not many people, they've been able to wreak a lot of havoc and cause a lot of misery, to the point that there's still former fighters in northern Uganda who worry, is Kony coming back to northern Uganda, which should, seems kind of preposterous, but then if you think about what they're still able to do in Central Africa, it makes a little bit of sense.
You mentioned that slavery and